everyone, and happy Pride Month. My name is Jeanette Southwood. My pronouns are she, her, elle. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Engineers Canada, and I'm an engineer myself. It brings me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Building Inclusive Workplaces for 2S LGBTQ plus peoples. As part of our commitment to incorporating Indigenous ways of being and knowing into the engineering profession, I would like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. I myself am a settler on these lands. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the effect of residential schools and colonialism on Indigenous families and communities, and to consider how we are and can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. As we dive into today's webinar, I want to wish you all a happy Pride Month. Pride is a time to celebrate the 2S LGBTQ plus community, their accomplishments, their resilience and resistances, and their strength. Pride 2024 marks the 55th anniversary of the Stonewall riots and the bravery of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, both trans women of color, and countless others for resisting the violence they faced for existing as members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. The engineering profession benefits from the contributions of the 2S LGBTQ plus community who work in our profession. However, there is still more work to be done to ensure that 2S LGBTQ plus folks feel welcomed in the profession while being their authentic selves. Engineers Canada and the National Association of Provincial and Territorial Regulators that license more than 300,000 members of the engineering profession in Canada is the national voice of the engineering profession. One of Engineers Canada's core purposes is to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession that reflects Canadian society. That's why we're happy to host this Pride Month conversation about building inclusive workplaces and welcoming for 2S LGBTQ plus people. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, Kim Bouffard. Kim is our moderator for today's session. Kim is the manager of Belonging and Engagement at Engineers Canada. She oversees Engineers Canada's work towards gender equity and truth and reconciliation, and she manages Engineers Canada's outreach and engagement initiatives, including 2 national systems change projects, the 30 by 30 initiative and the K-12 Collective Impact Project. Kim currently serves as the president for the Canadian Coalition of Women in Engineering, Science, Trades, and Technology, also known as CC West. So Kim, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jeanette, and happy Pride, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I just want to kick things off, letting you know that we're really hoping to have a very engaging, authentic conversation today. And throughout the session, we're going to be providing you with opportunities to be able to ask questions. So you'll notice that there is a Q&A function. And within that Q&A, there's an opportunity for you to upvote questions. And so when we get to the Q&A portion, I will be taking a look at that, and I'll be prioritizing the question, of course, that get the most upvote to bring to our panelists. As always, we want any questions or anything that are put forward to be constructive. We really do want you to feel comfortable, be able to ask the questions that you have today. But we do ask that you do it in a respectful manner. So with that, today's conversation is sponsored by TD Insurance. So TD Insurance has proudly served members of Engineers Canada for, oh my goodness, the last 51 years. And so they've been providing us with preferred insurance rates on cars, homes, condo, and tenant coverage as part of Engineers Canada's sponsored programs. TD Insurance is proud to sponsor Engineers Canada in our efforts to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession. And TD continues to champion diversity and inclusion in all aspects of their business. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, all champions and trailblazers of the 2SLGBTQ+ community. So I'm going to kick it off first with Michelle Liu. So Michelle uses they, them pronouns and is a lawyer as of 2024. So congratulations. I know we just got that announcement not too long ago. Michelle is also a professional engineer, speaker, activist, policy consultant, researcher, and uninvited third-generation settler on traditional Algonquin land. As a queer, non-binary, racialized, and neurodivergent person, Michelle's focus across their undertaking is on using their subject matter knowledge and lived experience to influence individuals, organizations, and systems to advance social justice. Michelle earned their honors, BS, Bachelor of Science, and Master of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Waterloo, and worked for various consulting engineering firms before pursuing a law degree and engineering PhD simultaneously, because we all know that just doing an engineering degree is enough. They were able to do both, so congratulations, at the University of Ottawa. Critical, decolonial, absolutionist, and intersectional frameworks are among the lenses through which Michelle conducts their work. Michelle is the recipient of over 20 awards from various institutions for their leadership, activism, and impact, including being named an EDI leader in engineering workplaces by Engineers Canada in 2021 and 2022. So huge welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michelle. Joining Michelle today is Martine Roy, a strong advocate for LGBT rights. Martine was dismissed from the Canadian Armed Forces for her homosexuality age 19, at which time she led the class action that concluded with an apology from the federal government in 2017. Martine has served as a member of the board of directors of Pride at Work Canada for the last 10 years, a Toronto-based organization she founded with 7 other individuals. She was also president of the Foundation Emergence until 2017. Currently, Martine is regional manager of the 2SLGBTQ+ business development for Quebec and Eastern Canada with TD Bank Group. In 2023, she was appointed a member of the Order of Canada for her tireless efforts as a leader, activist, and advocate for diversity, inclusion, and equity in Canada's 2SLGBTQ+ communities. So welcome to both of you. We're really happy to have you here today. So with that, although I know that I've given sort of a brief overview and introduction, I would like to, before we kick it off, just give you both an opportunity to share a bit more about yourselves. Basically, like, how long have you been involved in championing 2SLGBTQ+ issues in Canada, and share anything else that you'd like to share with the audience today.
So hi, hi everyone. I think it was am I okay? It was me first to talk. Yes, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone to have me. Thank you, Michelle, for being here, Kim, and all, and Jeanette for presenting us. I started very young. I started, like you said, in the army when I was fired for being an homosexual or sexual orientation, which I didn't think I didn't even know if I was a lesbian or not. I was very young, but it continued in my life as a woman. I find that as a woman, I had to take my place a lot. So even I went and worked at Post Canada at one point. I was the only woman in the office because there was no other woman working there or any places. So I always had that, trying to get that equity, to get that same chance, that we're able to do it. And it was only when I entered IBM in 1999 for Y2K that I really did get that chance. And how important it was to have a company with a policy since 1953 of inclusion and mostly for women. So I was feeling, I was able to take my place. So I did a lot of activism there, starting an employee resource group in St. John and Montreal, supervised all Montreal as well in Canada. So for me, it's all the time. And at the same time, we did present like the non-ceded territory. I'm married with a Two-Spirit woman, and she is from Tobic First Nation. So both of my children are band members. And it was important for me to understand and as well to respect and to work with the Two-Spirit community. So when you start presenting in my bio, you know, I'm an old lesbian from old time. So we used to say LGBT, but today we say 2SLGBTQ+, as you can see the color I put behind me, because I think it's very important. For a long time, I didn't see it, but I was very privileged to be a white lesbian compared to a lot of sister or people around me that had other degree, you know, from other community and from the indigenous community that we colonized. So today I really try to be very, to work with everyone around the table.
Great, thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, for that generous welcome, and thanks to the hundreds of folks who registered and you know, the nearly 100 who joined us live today. And you know, maybe I'll start by saying that I often say that I stand on the shoulders of giants in my advocacy and activism work, and I'm really just so honored that Engineers Canada, you know, invited me and thought of me to speak alongside, of course, the great Martine, and who's just such a giant in the advocacy for, you know, in the advancement of 2SLGBTQ+ rights and equality in Canada. If you haven't gathered that from their introduction, of course, in their opening remarks, since I'm just really honored to be here. So my name is Michelle, as you've heard, they, them pronouns, and I'm as well an uninvited third-generation settler based on Algonquin territory. And I guess maybe I'll just add that what didn't come up in my intro is why I went to law school after having a career in engineering, and it wasn't to be an overachiever. So, you know, leaving a well-paying job to go back to school as a mature student was not at all an easy decision. I went to law school really mostly out of spite, as I often say, out of, you know, the anger that I accumulated from my encounters with racism, homophobia, ableism, and gender-based violence, especially in my engineering career. So just to sort of answer the question of how long I've been involved in advocating for 2SLGBTQ+, you know, issues and rights. You know, I think very early on in my whole life, including throughout my undergraduate engineering education that started over 12 years ago. So it's really been a lifelong journey as well. Just like Martine said, it's all the time, always. It's who we are. It's not a hat we put on when we come to a talk and take it off when we leave. I think it's just, you know, it's the identity and the experience that we have, that we live with. And maybe we'll just wrap up by saying that you know, I think we're here to discuss a topic that maybe, you know, some of the remarks may be difficult for many people, including those impacted, including myself. So I just want to offer a trigger warning so that folks can be prepared to do what they need to do to feel okay, to feel safe. You know, if as I'm speaking, you want to log off or mute me, to just take a breath, that's, you know, I would encourage folks to do that. Just want to make sure everyone's going to feel okay and safe about our discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Michelle. So with that, I'm going to get into, we have a series of questions. And I know that when I was speaking with Martine and Michelle preparing for today, one of the things that we discussed was how important it is just to sort of set some context to help people make sure that they have a clear understanding of how did we get here. So right now, I'm sure many of you have been hearing that there's a lot in the news lately about 2SLGBTQ+ issues. Specifically, we're seeing homophobic and transphobic legislation appearing in Alberta, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. We're also seeing a rise in hate crimes and a number of anti-2SLGBTQ protests happening across Canada. And so my first question is actually to Martine. And Martine, I'm wondering if you could just help us to understand, how did we get here?
It is important to understand for sure we get there and how we can, you know, change things to a certain point. For sure, we did win a lot of rights. And when we gain a lot of rights, it does disturb people because we're taking our space. So by getting the gay marriage, by getting the right to have children, or even for kids of 14 years old in Quebec to change their name, a lot of things. It seems that it does a backlash, and we have to go back. If we go back in the 80s, where I'm from, you look at when I was discriminated, there was a law. It was a law to say if you're an homosexual, you're a sexual deviant. For a long time, there was law. There was even a medical, you know, that was saying that we were sick, psychologically sick, for a long time as well. That's why May 17 is so important, because they took it off May 17. that it is not an illness to be an homosexual or to be a non-binary, queer or trans person. So, and trans even it took longer, okay? Because that's the thing we have to understand. We all got put in the same place together, not necessarily because we go through the same thing. And this is what people are saying today. That's why there's a lot of people raising their hand, because we're always saying LGB for a very long time. And we were not talking about trans people because we're saying, oh, this is different. It's not part of, right? And then the trans community say, no, it's not different. It's part of, and we should be with you and you should help us take our place like the lesbian and the gay and the bisexual did. So that's why we slowly take in to say, me, I know it's in 2015 when I was the president of Fondation Emergence, that I had it at the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia. So there's an evolution that happened. And that evolution for me, it's like anything. You can just say, okay, we acquire and we can just sit and say, no problem. It's not like that. And because we disturb a lot of people, they're coming back really hard on us. It's very religious. It always been very religious. Let's go back to that. Even the colonization was religious. So they're using religion and money to try to counterpart what we're doing. And right now they're touching youth because youth is a very, very touchy subject for everybody. And they know now we're not just talking about consensual man and woman, we're talking about youth. So this is why I think we're back there and we have to be careful. We have to be careful. I went through the purge and other people left through discrimination. Michelle talked about it. This is trauma. We don't want to go through that. And trauma bring people to not be well and mental illness and a lot of effect around us. So we need to stand still and really make sure that we're vigilant about all this. And that at the end of the day, the thing we have to think is, how can somebody be authentic when they're authentic to themselves? They're happy, they're focused. And that's for every trade. And mostly as an engineer, I think it's a very important thing. So it's a little bit what I believe that is happening and why we're seeing so much, like you said, New Brunswick, Alberta, and United States. And if you look into it, it's a lot about religion. Did we get scared during COVID? Did religion rise? Did more people went to religious? That's all the question we need to ask ourselves. You know, why is it coming back? And what happened in Ottawa too? Right? With all the trucker and everything. There's like, people are angry and they're using that anger to try to dismantle what we built for years. And this is why it's so important. And hopefully what we build and how we put it in charter, like in the Charter of Right of Quebec and the Charter in Federal, will help us defend ourselves with all that.
Mm. So yeah, I think, you know, what I'm hearing, Martine, of course, is that we need to be very vigilant. Like you said, like there's things that are changing. And also that it's within your lifetime, within our lifetime, that, you know, homosexuality was considered to be a mental illness and that it was illegal. It was legislated that that there was consequences for being gay. And so we've made some progress, but we're starting to see some backtracking there. And like you said, there's a lot of different things at play. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Michelle. Michelle, as an engineer and as a lawyer, you know, knowing where we've come from and where we are currently, again, just helping to set this context, because, you know, we're here as part of Pride, but Pride hasn't been, you know, in existence for more than 50 years, you know, so it historically is relatively new, really. What most concerns you with the direction that we see we're going when it comes to human rights legislation and public discourse around, you know, two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex people in Canada? Like, are there some very specific things that you're concerned about or that you think that we need to be very vigilant around?
Yeah, I think just largely echoing what Martine has already said, you know, I think what most concerns me is that, you know, hate, intolerance, right, this like divisive and individualist, like me against you, if you know, if you're not like me, then, you know, we must be in opposition, like this whole mindset, right? These are really on the rise, I think, across Canada, just like in the US and arguably, you know, in the rest of the world. And, you know, the rights and safety and dignity right, of many equity-seeking people or groups and people are more at risk than ever here in Canada. You know, we often talk about just the US, and we like to think that these things are only happening in the US because of Trump, but it is certainly here in Canada as well, of course, including things that impact 2SLGBTQ plus persons. And I think I often, you know, come up against devil's advocates. And so for those who are maybe skeptical or who like to say, well, is it really? I'll just, you know, add to, you know, some of the things that Martine has already said. Just in the last 2 years alone, we've seen hundreds of hate motivated protests, you know, targeting already marginalized groups, whether it be the 33 coordinated, you know, national anti-trans protests, including one that took place here in Ottawa that I attended last fall, or, you know, Martine mentioned the Freedom Convoy that was incredibly, you know, white supremacist, fascist, ableist, you know, demonstration that was here for over a month in the capital. It seized the capital for over a month and harassed and caused violence against, you know, many groups, including 2SLGBTQ plus people, as well as, of course, racialized, disabled, and other equity-seeking communities in general. And I was reading a CSIS report. CSIS is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. They published an annual report, and recently they actually identified the anti-2SLGBTQ plus movement as one of the greatest domestic terrorism threats facing our country now and for years to come. So in that report, CSIS named the attack, they gave some examples, and the attack on a gender studies class where a queer professor was stabbed, that took place at my alma mater at the University of Waterloo just last year, right? So it's not 10, 20 years ago, this is now just last year. That's one of the examples that CSIS listed as, you know, examples of extreme violence against the 2SLGBTQ plus community or against other targets that these perpetrators view as representing the gender ideology agenda. So some examples there, and we've also seen, as Martine mentioned, and you've mentioned, Kim, you know, bills and policies that have popped up in almost every province restricting the rights and freedom of different communities, you know, whether it be religious minorities, refugees, unhoused or low-income persons, and of course, 2SLGBTQ plus persons, especially trans youth, as was mentioned earlier, and their families. So just again, to name a few more examples. And so what happens, right, in legislatures and what we see in the media and in public discourse can really directly impact, you know, every aspect of our lives, right? So this really means that we're seeing a surge of not only, you know, hate motivated crimes and violence on the streets, but also a surge of workplace violence and harassment that, you know, fields like engineering is not immune from. You know, far from it. I think often in engineering, we like to think that we're very special, we're different, but really we're not, right? We're susceptible to these things. And so what really concerns me, I guess, to answer the question, is that these conversations are so important for everyone to have, including engineers, because we're really going backwards as a society. And, you know, I just don't really see, what concerns me is that I don't see a critical mass of people caring. You know, when I'm in social settings, I don't know if this is other people's experience, but when I'm in social settings, I don't get the sense that a lot of people are concerned about these things. And often when I bring these things up, like when people who have kids that go to school, I want to know what they and their kids are doing about the rise in suicide rates amongst trans kids. You know, do you know about it? What's going on? Like, you know, do you care? What are you saying about it? And often I'm made to feel like such a pest, you know, such a downer for bringing these things up at in the social setting. So the fact that people don't even want to talk about or think about these issues really concerns me. And I think I'll just wrap up with this point where, you know, the ways that our elected decision makers are conducting themselves also really concern me. Instead of, you know, addressing the real issues facing our country, like, you know, the housing crisis, the state of our healthcare system, the cost of living. I mean, Ottawa has such a huge unhoused population, for example. You know, politicians are instead taking cheap shots at, you know, vulnerable communities like trans youth and LGBTQ people who have fought so hard for these rights, simply to sow division, to pit us against each other so they can gain power and be elected, right? So some of these are I think, the things that we need to talk more about, you know, raise awareness, be aware, speak amongst people, your colleagues, your friends, neighbors, take action, vote, write to your MPs and MPPs, you know, city councillors. Really, you know, I think we need to do more. And what concerns me is that I'm not seeing people do these things.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting when I'm listening to you and Martine speak about these issues. And, you know, what might surprise people on the call today is, for instance, that it's like you're talking about housing, you're talking about racism, you're talking about a variety of different things, and how, the two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer community there's this huge intersection, right? Because within that community, you have people who are Black, you have people who are Indigenous, you have people who are homeless, you have people who are rich. I mean, there is, this community is impacted by all the things that you were mentioning, and it's all interconnected. I know that one of the main things that I think that a lot of people who are joining us today want to know, and we understand it's a systemic issue, and we know that engineering doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? But what specifically, like what role do workplaces specifically, and you don't have to get into all the things that workplaces do, we'll get into that a little bit later, but maybe when you're looking at this as a systemic issue and you're seeing, you're hearing about it in politics, you're hearing about it on the street, in the media, but what role do workplaces have in ensuring that 2SLGBTQ plus employees feel safe? And maybe what I'll do is I'll pass it to Martine first, and then Michelle, I encourage you to sort of to add in anything else that you'd like to. So Martine.
The role is one of the most critical roles. For me, work is the hub of our life. 75% of our time we're at work. This is where we want to perform. That's where we want to be focused, productive. We want to win. We want to get the promotion, and that's where we need to be authentic. So if we talk about being authentic, if you're authentic and you're homosexual, bisexual, transgender, you have to be out. And for that, you have to be not accepted, included by your peer around you. You cannot be excluded. So for me, the workplace is really critical for those changes, because everything happened there. So what you tell your colleague, how you talk to them, you're going to influence them. They're going to go back home. They're going to talk to their kid. I'm going to give you a quick example. I had an engineer around me, and when I was at IBM, and one of them was making really bad joke about gay people. He didn't know that one of his friends that he went to school in engineering was out since 10 years. Okay, but not out, but was gay, not out, totally, since 10 years. Somebody told him, and he felt really bad, so he went to see his friend that is gay, and he apologized, and that friend told him, be careful. Be careful of the joke you're saying and all that, because, and then he said, do you have children? And that man says, yes, I have boys. Well, 4 months later, one of his boys came out. And the father, engineer, really like sure of himself, was like, wow, thank God we talked about it prior to that. Because I wouldn't have the same reaction toward my child than I had now. And that young person came to see me a year later to take me to help his father to be more inclusive. So that's the impact. It's a little story, but it means everything. We change the life of so many people just by doing that. And that's what's important. You have to question yourself. Why is it that it bothers you? What is it changing, and the skills that person has and what they can bring to the table? I find that sexual orientation and gender identity, I don't understand why we're so troubled by it. Because for me, it's a strength, it's a force. And if we use it, I remember being at IBM and being 30 around the table, our difference was our strength. That's the way I see it. And I see the workplace very critical about it, because the message we pass to others, the implication we do. We can be an ally of the employee resource group that is the 2SLGBTQ, or we can go to the Pride event, or we can make sure that we show that we are inclusive and we are careful about the jokes that are made or things that are done. And what we do as a person means a lot. People sometimes, when we listen to what we say, me and Michelle, about legislation and all that, can seem overwhelming, and people can say, oh my God, I'm so small, and that all that thing. Well, if I thought that, I would never did what I did, and Michelle would never do what she does. We are not small. We are very meaningful, and we can change things one person at a time. And I always said one desk at a time.
Well, you bring up a good point. I mean, still to this day, when you go and you meet somebody new, what's one of the first questions you ask, right? What do you do? Where do you work? It's a huge part of our identity. And so, workplaces have a key role to play in that. Michelle, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? Sort of what you see as the role of workplaces in ensuring that 2SLGBTQ plus employees feel safe?
Yeah, I think as Martine said, workplaces are so important because most of us spend so much time at work, right? It's such a core part of our lives. And I think that, just add to what's been said, I think another role that workplaces really have that I think is important is really just to get away from lip service and performative actions and really rethink how they're spending their, often perceived at least as very limited resources around EDI and really look at who's actually benefiting. Is it actually impacting the people who are in need of more equity, more support, and so on. I just find that in EDI conversations, we too often, right, focus and talk about what allies or leaders can do or what organizations can do to, advance EDI. And what often happens is that we forget to speak about or speak directly to the people who are actually excluded, the people who are experiencing discrimination, right? We're here, right? We exist, right? So people often talk about giving resources like, lunch and learn budgets to our allies or to managers and senior executive leaders so that they can get training and get educated. And that's great. I think that's super important. That needs to happen. But at the same time, are we also thinking about the equity seeking people in the meantime? While their bosses are getting trainings and while the system trickles along ever so slowly, what are the people impacted supposed to do, right? Like, for example, I've gone to speak at a lot of organizations where they pour resources into hiring someone, like me to do training, with their leaders, which is great. I like making a living and that's great. But at the same time, I'm non-binary, for example, and often the buildings I'm invited to speak in don't have a gender neutral washroom. And their employees who come out to the session who are non-binary, like it's great. This organization spent a ton of money to get their managers or leaders to get EDI training over a fancy lunch. But meanwhile, their non-binary or trans employees have to experience like severe anxiety just for wanting to use the washroom, right? So it's this like disparity of, sometimes we think that we're doing the right thing, we're spending the money, but it's really to, pause. And I think that's the role, is to pause and maybe take a step back and reflect on how people are spending their resources and who's actually benefiting.
So what I'm hearing, just to like iterate back what I've sort of heard from both of you, when I think about the workplace and specifically the role, because we spend so much time in the workplace has a role to play in creating safe spaces, and they have a leadership role to play in like really practicing what they preach, outside of like, and I know sometimes when we get into EDI things, we always try and dive into the business case. I mean, we know that, large engineering firms, their primary mandate isn't EDI. Why is it that workplaces should care about this? If it's not directly tied, or maybe it is directly tied to the bottom line, but if you had to give like 2 reasons today for someone who's on the call and has an organization of why they might want to up this on their priority, or why they might want to take a look and see how their organization is doing, what would be the things that you would ask them to sort of think about or look at? Maybe Michelle, I'll pass this to you first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a $1 million question. I think that, I think if we were to think within, I think it really depends on the type of workplace and the type of organization that somebody works at, right? I think in our capitalist, structure society that we exist in, I think often we often make the pitch or the business case for EDI and how hiring diversity, elevates the bottom line and so on and so forth. That's really not my narrative at all. I'm really very much interested in and believe in, the human rights and social justice narrative. People deserve to be included and hired and supported at work, whether they improve or hurt the bottom line, right? I think but of course that's contrary to the capitalist sentiment that we live in. So, but let's just park that for a second, and I'll just talk about sort of the human rights and the more sort of social justice oriented dimension. So, just to share my thing, I've dealt with so much, racism, homophobia, and all those the different forms of discrimination, both in my previous career in construction engineering and project management, as well as now in my activism work, both in and outside of engineering. I think, why should workplaces care? Well, I think people just aren't having a good experience. People don't feel included, and people don't feel, safe. People don't feel like they're able to participate fully. And I think, people have the right. People should inherently be able to do those things and feel those things, right? And so, for example, I don't really have any success stories in terms of reporting to HR, to my manager, or even to really finding allies in engineering during my career. And that's why I left and went to law school. And I'm not saying that that's the answer. I'm not saying that everyone should do that, but, you know, and I'm not saying this to be a downer or to imply that, you know, law school is the answer again, but I just want to really paint a picture that's realistic, because I think these conversations sometimes get too positive. And, you know, there's often this like focus of, you know, we're doing better, things are getting better. But, you know, are they really, you know, perhaps for some, but really not everybody, right? If you're a cis hetero white woman, for example, maybe it's getting better for you, but have you asked your, you know, disabled colleague or your trans colleague or your Black, Indigenous colleagues and racialized colleagues if things are better for them in, you know, the construction industry, for example? I would wager a guess that, you know, no, right? So, and I'm non-binary, for example, again, just, and often buildings don't have washrooms for me, or often people still do the thing of asking me where I'm from, where I'm really from. And so I think it gets hard for somebody like me to hear how things are getting better, you know, when I, again, have these experiences and often feel anxious, feel unable to really show up and don't feel safe. And so, you know, the point here wasn't just to be negative, but I wanted to be realistic and paint a realistic, you know, picture that things are pretty bleak, I think. And so workplaces should care, because things are bleak and people feel awful, and people, you know, I mean, you know, mental health is poor amongst, you know, LGBTQ people. I have a point later on where I talk about, you know, an elevated, almost twice as likely for a queer person or a trans person. Actually, trans is much higher, but 2S LGBTQ plus people in general are twice as likely to attempt or commit suicide, for example, right? So, and we should care about that.
Absolutely. Martine, I know that, you know, you work in the banking finance sector now. You worked for IBM before tech sector, and we know there's lots of parallels between these sectors and engineering. I'm wondering, you know, what's your take on why workplaces should care outside of the fact that it's just like all the things that Michelle has outlined, right? That it's human rights issues. You could put yourself in a legally challenging position if you're not, you know, following human rights issues, regardless of what business you're in. But what are your thoughts on this? What is it that you'd like workplaces to think about as to why this might be an important issue?
I think to start with, we have to change the narrative. And that's what I learned, like with company like IBM, okay? Because at the end of the day, you want to have the best of the best. If you want to have the best of the best talent around the table, you cannot stop yourself from the gender or where they're from and things like that. You want to have the best. And for me, that was the best school, was IBM, because they had a policy since 1953. But when I was there was that employee resource group that was there. And it was a bit like victim, okay? The women are in the victim employee resource group, the 2SLGBT victim, you know, it was like the minority on the side. And that too is not right, because I think that we're all part of the business. We're all the talent. So that's why the company needs to care, because if they care and they care about us, we're going to be the best talent ever. So we changed the narrative at IBM, but then it followed at TD, and only TD does it. And for me, that change from the lip services, like Michelle was saying, or the rainbow washing, because now you have people that do business development in the 2S LGBTQ community. What it means is we change the narrative to that minority victim group to say, no, we're part of the business. We're a business resource group, and we can develop, and we are part of it. And that helps. It helps first because we can quantify, you know, we can see all the business that works with us and everything, and show that if you really mean well and you really hire and you have the right program, you're going to retain and you're going to attract. And this is what's happening in my corporation. We retain, we attract, because we take it seriously. We bring it to another level. And just as a parenthesis, it's 10 years that TD is doing that, and they're the only financial institution. And you have IBM. So it's kind of particular. And when I say evolve, that's part of it. I think it's important for companies, when they want to care, that they show the evolve, because we're changing. We're not the same type of company of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, or the 1900s, or the 2000. We're way somewhere else. And it's so important that people around the table feel that we care about them, because we want to retain them. So there's a price to it, and we call it the cost of the closet. There's a cost for people to stay in the closet. If they stay and they cannot say what they did the last weekend, they're gonna lie. And if they lie, they're gonna lie the Tuesday, and they're gonna lie on Wednesday, and on Thursday, and sometimes they're gonna promise to remember all they lie and everything, and they're gonna be excluded. Those people is gonna cost over $2 million on lost time a year. So you want to quantify the loss when your people are not authentic at work and happy. And it's proven. All the company that has a good culture set, you know, and EDI for me, again, I don't think it should be a position in life. I think it should be taught at school. Elementary and secondary should be a skill. Everybody should be equitable. Everybody should be inclusive and should embrace diversity. So for me, that's why they should care. To attract the best talent, to retain the best talent, to have the most productive people and their corporation, to be the most successful corporation at the end of the day, or engineering or anywhere, I think it's important, and mostly in engineering. Because of the past and being mostly men, we need to attract women. You need to attract women. To do that, you have to show that you have the culture that comes with it, first and foremost, because we say 2SLGBTQ, but don't forget there's more women in those letters than men. Where are they? That's my question.
Interesting. I know that, so part of what you were getting at, you know, when you're starting to talk about why workplaces should care, you started also talking a little bit about what are some of the things that you've noticed have been successful in the workplaces and what haven't, you know, so you talked about employee, resource groups and how, how they're structured and who's part of them matters. And that, in your experience, it hasn't been super successful if it's the people who are being marginalized that are trying to, that the people who are disempowered and being marginalized, the ones who are the only people who make up that group, that it really needs to be an entire workplace. So I know that I would like to believe the majority of people want to do the right thing, and so I think there's a number of workplaces out there and engineering employers who are putting things in place, but maybe just aren't seeing, the kind of impact and success that they thought they would have. And so I'm wondering, based on your experience, Martine, and again, Michelle, I'd like you to add to this question, but what can an organization do to create a safe space for 2SLGBTQ plus people? Like, what does a safe space look like in practice? And again, I'm looking at it from like an organization standpoint. So my organization, I'm looking at you, is like, I want to do the right thing. What does safe space look like? And what are some of the things that might lead to success in us getting there?
It's a very holistic thing to do, I think, because it's not just one thing. I believe it's all the education and the sensibilization you're gonna do to every staff, not just the hierarchy, not just the VP, but everyone. When you do things like us, we did all the pronoun. Well, it's a big initiative, and to tell everybody to put the pronoun and put that in place, it's another great message to send to people, like Michelle said, that are, they're worried about saying they're non-binary, they don't feel included, or they're trans, or they're people of color. Well, if we say that the whole company did a program for 1 year to add the pronoun to everyone, and they even did it to the customer, we're sending a message. Then after there's I find that internship. I'm really lucky to have internship in Quebec, where I can hire someone from the community that is more marginalized to come and work in a branch. And that person, I create the position so that person can work. And if ever that person wants to do the transition, then they can take the time. I'm not taking a position away. So that's another real concrete way. That's what people need. So for the employee resource group, they need money. You cannot just say, oh, we have an employee resource group and they need a budget. They need to have a strategy. They need to get the support. They need to get the support from everyone. The other thing that is important, you need to make this important. So you need to put it in the evaluation. At IBM, that's what we did. And even at TD, it's part of the evaluation of the company, of the people, of the manager. It's part of it. What do you do for the communities? How do you get involved? What do so all those messages. And I think it's important too for an employee to know the policy of their company, because those will tell them, is it a company that I can be safe in or not? Because that's what I was saying in the Globe and Mail article. If you go there and you don't see those policies, well, you maybe not going to be protected. You maybe not going to find a place that you wanted that is inclusive. You can, that's why I always say, go look at Pride at Work Canada, because all the companies that are member have to have an employer source group with the right policy. So it can help to decide, is that's going to be a safe space for me. The other thing I can say is like, you cannot, we need everybody. So I know sometimes people get tokenized. Sometimes you're alone. Sometimes you feel like you're the only one. And it happens. Other people can come out, and that's another part that the company needs to do. It's help those people to come out and get engaged. So give them time. You know, you cannot say, oh no, don't take that hour to go do that group, stay at work. Well, then it won't work. And they won't be able to get assistance. So that's the other part. It's a all. So give them money, give them time for that employee resource group, give them visibility, give them support. Always, I say, have a, we call it executive sponsor, and they give us usually somebody from the executive, and most of the time the best one is always not one from our community, because I don't know why they're bigger fighter for us at the end of the day, and they are the one that can really help to convince other heterosexual people why we matter and why it matter in their corporation, that we talk about it, that we are visible about it, and with those messages, people will feel safer. That's the way I see it for me.
So what I hear you saying there, just again to play back, so having these resource committees are super important, that they need to be resourced, that they need to have executive sponsors. So that way, you know, that information is going all the way to the top, and that throughout the organization, it's important to invest in training for everyone. And, you know, and then there's the little things that end up being big things, like, you know, putting, you know, asking people to put their pronouns, you know, as part of their signatures and those kind of things, so that people know that this is a safe space for them to be themselves. But one of the things you mentioned too, maybe I'll pass this to Michelle, maybe Michelle, you might be able to elaborate on this, but you talked a little bit about like the importance of those policies, those internal policies. And I'm just wondering, Michelle, and if you don't know, we can, you know, Martine, but what specifically do you mean by policies? You know, I'm thinking about the different jobs I've had in my life, and it's like, I don't ever remember combing through an organization's policies. So it's like, if I'm looking to make sure that I want to work at a place that I think is going to value and respect me as a member of this community, and you're mentioning that policies like resource groups, those things, that might be something I could find, but what do you mean by policies, and what does that look like? And there's other things that we should consider as well as a company to create a safe space.
Yeah, I think, you know, and this is something I often consult on with organizations, you know, and I'll just, you know, say fewer in engineering, but, you know, more in other industries, but that are moving toward having an EDI, whatever EDI broadly means, but having some kind of an EDI oriented policy that really sort of sets out, frankly, best practices, right, around, you know, how to do some of these things that we've talked about, you know, in a better way, in a way that, you know, is more centered on, you know, the experiences of, you know, the lived experiences of people, as opposed to just a bunch of, you know, let's say, you know, older white men in a boardroom trying to imagine what EDI and best practices might look like. There's an increasing sort of, you know, trend of developing policies that are really more grounded in lived experiences and more of the social justice principles. And some of the specific you know, components of that might include, you know, how to hold space for equity-seeking employees to have a discussion, come together, and I'll maybe just share some of the specifics that I've recommended before, including, you know, always acknowledging and centering the existence and impact of discrimination, right? So often people say, oh, no, there's discrimination, like capital D. No, there's none of that in our workplace. Like, oh yeah, there is, right? It's everywhere. It's all the time, everywhere. It never sleeps. It's alive and well. We haven't solved discrimination, just to be clear. So that's, you know, also just to be real about that, to not gaslight somebody when they say, oh, I've experienced discrimination. So just acknowledge, say yes, and center the impact of that, as opposed to starting to say, make excuses or explain how they must have misunderstood, or they're confused about the situation, or just acknowledge it as true. And then, being sensitive about the extra, whether you want to call it the invisible backpack, or as Martine said, the cost of being in the closet, just the extra psychological load, right, that discrimination and, exclusion overall creates for queer folks and equity seeking folks in general. And, also be prepared for whether, again, LGBTQ plus folks or 2SLGBTQ plus folks or other equity seeking employees or colleagues to tell you that they don't want to discuss something, or that they're not prepared to discuss something on your timeline, or that they're not prepared to be your token during Pride Month, for example. You might have a queer employee that you're like, oh yeah, Martine, you're going to give a talk during Pride, right? Martine might say, no. Are you going to pay me for it? If not, like, no, I don't want to do that. And so just be ready that your employees might say no thanks. And also just to be humble about that, and to be humble enough and have humility to admit that, sometimes, as a manager, or, as somebody who is a colleague, that you make a mistake, that you make mistakes, and that you got your facts wrong, or that you got somebody's pronouns wrong, or just that you made a mistake, just to not, I think, double down, which happens often. Not to get defensive, but just to say, you know what, I messed up, sorry about that, and move on, right? I think that's often what's lacking as well. And then just around a different piece here, around more, concrete, no pun intended, facilities or resources, I would say, neutralizing your washrooms, and I know people often say, well, we don't have the capital to renovate or to do construction in our office. Well, something as simple as changing the signs, right, of your washrooms. And I often joke that I'll actually bring a piece of paper and a marker, and I'll do it for you, right? It'll cost you nothing. And you'll stick it on the door, and that's it, right? That's often what restaurants were doing increasingly. They'll just tell you, this side has 6 urinals and 3 stalls, and this side has 6 stalls and 0 urinals, and that's it. Costs very little. And then Martine already mentioned pronouns, right? So implementing pronouns, just a pronouns field in whatever company database that your organization has, if it has one, something very simple like that, just to not, and I think people often, people who are very cis hetero presenting and unaware of other people's contexts often say, well, what's the point of that? It's so obvious that my pronouns are, he, him, or she, her. It's like, well, it might be obvious for you, but it's not obvious for everybody. Like, I'm often misgendered. People often use the wrong pronouns for me. And so by everybody indicating their pronouns, that makes me feel safer and more confident and comfortable indicating my pronouns, right? So that's a way to show allyship, no matter how obvious you think your pronouns are, just to have that in place. Maybe I'll end there, but those are some thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. The thing that you have me thinking about now is like, so there's organizations, workplaces, you want to be able to, let's say you're on this journey and you know that you want to create a safe place for all your employees. And in particular, you want to, and that of course is inclusive to LGBTQ plus peoples. And it sounds like a big part of doing this, putting together those policies and, getting people to feel comfortable about putting their pronouns, establishing these groups, is that there's some conversations that need to take place. But then I know, like what you were just saying too, is that sometimes these conversations are uncomfortable, right? I mean, these are uncomfortable conversations. You have people who don't know what they don't know. And you have some people who, depending on what their lived experience is, their cup might be full and it doesn't take much for it to spill over. So if it's vital for us to have these conversations within a workplace, so to establish these things and to make sure that the policies and stuff that we have is serving everyone, do you have any advice around, how do you start to go about having those conversations? And I know that, Martine, you had mentioned that this needs to go, top to bottom, all the way up. These conversations need to be happening throughout the organization. But just acknowledging that, these can be uncomfortable conversations, and I'm thinking like myself as an engineer, myself as a lawyer or whatever, coming into an organization, it's like, I don't necessarily have any training in this. This is not what I was expecting coming into my workplace today. Do you have any advice on what that could look like?
Well, I think those conversations, for sure, you don't need to have them in a group. You can have them apart, by respect. I think it's the best thing. What I always say too is sometime maybe not at the beginning of the day, maybe at the end of the day, like that, you have time to, to breathe. And if you need more time, or, I even say, don't do it on Monday, maybe do it on Friday. It's just like you try to position yourself. I went through some of those conversations even at IBM, because it's not because IBM has a policy that every region embrace the policy. And that's the thing. It's very important why Michelle was talking about policy. You need to know those, because you can be in, I don't know, New Brunswick, and they may be going to make you feel like there's no policy, but there is. And they will protect you. And they are important in your workplace, right? But I always go back to human. We're human, right? It's a very human thing to talk about. And we are the workplace, us, human. So we need to be well, and to be sane, and to be authentic, and to be open, and to work in accordance with everybody. Even it's not just 2SLGBTQ, in general with people. And I think it is important, those conversations. It's just the way you're going to do it, where you're going to do it, and how. And at the same time, sometimes it can be somebody's making that comment, and you don't want to accept that. You don't want to stay silent. But you know that if you say something there on the spot, it's going to create chaos, something, right? So I always tell to people, put it in your pocket. Don't forget about it. Do bring it. But that, like I say, maybe start one-on-one, And if you see that there's no reaction and all that, then you should bring it to your human resources. Because there is policy again. There is those policies that are there to protect you. But they are happening, and it is important. And sometimes they're not just about sexual orientation. Sometimes they're not just about gender identity, or they're vast. And I think it is our responsibility. Like I said, equity, diversity, and inclusion, we should breed it. It should be part of our DNA. Should not be a position. We should be like that. So, and it's not always obvious, because everybody hears so many misinformation right now. It's like horrible what people can hear, and judgment that they make, and have bias. And those bias are the ones that are really, and you need to undo them. So I don't know if I make clarity, but that's what I would suggest.
Michelle, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll say a few things that I think I've specifically recommended to engineering environments, and we're getting kind of specific here about some of the best practices, but some of the things that I often recommend is like, don't perpetuate the idea that emotions have no place in the workplace, which I know in engineering, we often, like in the STEM disciplines, we want to hang our feelings and our identities and emotions at the door, and we come in and we pretend like we're all like objective robots doing the same thing, and we're all going to arrive at the same correct answer. So I think there's a lot of that sentiment, and so I think just to really move away from that, and don't say things like, if an employee comes to you and says, I've experienced this, really move away from the thought, or even saying that you're being overly sensitive, you're being dramatic, which I got a lot in my time in engineering. I was often, and still am today, by different people, but made to feel like I'm so difficult, so sensitive, and that every day I complain about something. It's like, yeah, that's the whole problem, is that there is so much discrimination that, like, you think I want to spend all my time talking about it and experiencing it? Like, no, I don't, actually. And so I think just, to recognize that it's not a thing that, people are choosing, or that they're like necessarily looking for. It just happens to them. It's not a choice. And to have, compassion and acknowledgement for that. And then, along with that, not to minimize anybody's experience, right? Don't sort of tell them, well, it's not that big of a deal, and definitely don't allow, I think, the experience of privileged voices to dominate or become the focus, which again, something I experienced often when I would talk about sexual harassment or violence on construction sites. it'd be like, my boss who's a man, he would call in my two other colleagues who are men, and the four of us would have a little chat, and the conversation would end as, oh, there's no problem, right? Because my boss would ask my two other colleagues who are men if they also felt like there was sexual harassment on site, right? And so of course their voices dominated the conversation, and so the conclusion was that nope, there's no problem, everything's fine, right? So and then the last thing I'll say here is just to not, I think, be, especially for engineering minded folks, to maybe move away from being really solution oriented. I think there's such a tendency to really want to focus on the solution in engineering. We're such problem solvers. Well, there are some problems that we just can't solve alone in a day, with within one project. I think instead state a commitment to be part of, a process, right? I think this is, as we've talked about extensively, this is a societal systemic process that 1 or 2 or 100 engineers alone can't solve. And so just be okay with that, sit with that, and just commit to doing better tomorrow, the next day, and that's it. And to be okay with that discomfort of not being able to fix it all alone.
That's actually a fantastic transition to, I think, another burning question that I imagine many of the people on the call have today. So, I mean, Martine, you had mentioned a couple times how, we can't do this alone. I think the last stat that I saw was that 1.3 million Canadians identify as being part of the 2SLGBTQ plus community. So I think, what we're reliant on and what we need are allies. And I think that there's a lot of people on the call today who are like, how do I be a good ally? Like, what does it mean to be an ally in the workplace? And, for our community, since, it's Engineers Canada, many of the people on the call today are engineers, are working in engineering workplaces, So if I want to be an ally, and I want to be an ally in an engineering firm or a place where, it's predominantly men, maybe cis white male, like, what does that look like? What do you have any tips or any advice for those out there who really want to champion this, for this community? And maybe I'll pass it to Martine first.
And what's very important too when we talk about allyship is that allyship is not heteronormative. Not only heterosexual people should be ally. We should have allyship and between the lesbian, the gay, the bisexual, the transgender, people of color, two-spirited. They need allyship there too. And that's what sometimes people don't think about. And it's very, very important because you're gonna have that white man gay. Sometimes will be misogyn. Sorry to say, and I always say, it's the most opposite pole, a man that loves a man and a woman that loves a woman. So we get put together, but to a certain point, it's not the same thing. So it needs to be an allyship there. That one part I wanted to bring, because we always say ally, and I always feel like we talk about only that heterosexual person. So it can be many people. And it can be done different way. That's the way I like it. It's very agile to be an ally, and it's very flexible to be an ally, because 1 year, if you're too busy to be there, it's okay, and if it's just a question of being the one that will say to that colleague, it's not right the way they talk, it's okay too. And if it's because they're going to be at the Pride March, that too. So I see an ally, different level. I see an ally that can be 1 year more present, and things happen in their life, they're less, but it's that inside job, meaning, for them, they're inclusive. For them, there's no difference. They love me the way I am. They love Martine. They love Michelle. They love Kim. They don't love us because we're because of our sexual orientation. It's for who we are. And I always see it as our nuance, because we all have those nuances. So it's always to bring that back to that person that you ask to be your ally. At the end of the day, why are they your friend, or why do they like you? It's for you, for who you are. It has nothing to do with your sexual orientation or your gender identity. So to bring it back there, and at the same time, they are there to help us have a voice. And sometimes an heterosexual, heteronormative person can, when really well, convince another one better than us. because sometime between them, each other, they understand, and because it's going to be another person from that is heterosexual. Sometimes I don't know. It makes they're gonna say, "Oh yes, okay," they're gonna listen, because that's the problem. They don't listen enough to us, and they should. That's for me the allyship, and it has so many different way or flavor. And I always think, I always think, and I think people should think, kids, who's coming, what's the message we want to pass? Do we want to pass a message that we're not inclusive, we discriminate people, we judge everybody, we have bias to our kid? Or we want to show our kids that we're open-minded, that we are inclusive, that we're going to love them no matter what? Because like Michelle said, a lot of young youth transgender are killing themselves right now, because what they're hearing from the radio, from the news and all that, and they're scared. And they need ally right now. They need that person and their family, that can be a brother, a cousin, a mother, a grandmother, that says it's okay. We got you. Talk with us. Stay with us. We're going to help you. And if you're at the wrong school, we're going to help you move. We're going to, this is what allyship, it's going to be a family as well. Because don't forget, when the kids goes to school, if he's not included and all that, the only place he can go back to is home. And if he's not included at home and there's nobody taking care of him, where is that kid's going to go? How is he going to survive that? That's why, for me, it has so many flavors, so many ways. And I think it evolved as well, because now we need them more than ever. Before, it was maybe because we wanted to get married, we wanted the blood, all those rights. Now we need them because they're targeting our children. And that's really touchy, I find. I find it's gonna destroy a lot of life if we let them do it this way. That's for sure.
I think it's great that you could mention, because, like you said, I think a lot of people, when we're thinking allyship, we're not thinking about how even within this community, it's a very diverse community. So like a lived experience of, two homosexual white men is very different. It might not be super relatable to, a trans couple, or, and so I think that's really interesting there, how like even within the community, like when we're thinking about allyship, it's like we have to be there for each other and advocate for each other. And so I think that's a very, really good point. Michelle, what are some of the key things that you think, and again, just sort of tying it back to the workplace? I know again that this is something that transcends the workplace. We don't live and work in a vacuum. But are there any, specific things that when you're going into workplaces, you're talking to people about, what can you do as an ally? Because I know that there's a lot of people who want to do it. They're just not quite sure exactly what it is that they could do. And Martine touched on a couple of good points. I'm wondering if there's anything else in particular that you tend to tell organizations when you speak to them, and people who want to champion and ally this for us.
Yeah, I just want to maybe start by noting that I feel like ally, increasingly is not a title that I think, it's not a self-declared title. Like I can't just go and say I'm an ally to, Black or Indigenous communities. I think that's something that they have to, it's an honor and, a trust and a label or title that they give me. I can't just go walk around and declare that about myself, right? So when companies, managers I meet want me to tell them what they can do to be an ally, I'm like, that's, ask your employees, they, discuss with them what they would like, and then maybe they'll consider you as an ally, right? I think that's maybe often the misunderstanding. It's not like, it's a gold star that if you complete all the steps, you get the gold star, you put it on your resume, right? It's not quite. I think it's really more of something that should center the people who you're trying to be the ally to. It's up to them. So that's maybe like the little sidebar I'll do on ally, but then some of the other, more specific, acts of allyship, I guess, or maybe not even allyship, but just, some of the bare minimums I think that I often remind people of, and they might seem really obvious, but they're really things that I often actually get pushbacks on. So, slurs and jokes, for example. I think, somebody who's never mind ally, but somebody who just wants to, foster an inclusive workplace. I think, steering clear of slurs and jokes, right? Like slurs, obviously, don't ever do it. you know, whether it's LGBTQ slurs or others, just don't do it. Don't do it. Not even when you're singing along to a song or just joking. No one's laughing. It's not funny. Don't do it. And same with, you know, jokes, like Martine mentioned earlier, just really to err on the side of caution, especially because historically some of the long-standing, you know, dad jokes, if you will, often, you know, there's somebody at the butt of that joke, and often it's queer people, right? You know, so really just to err on the side of caution, especially if you're like a cis hetero person, just steer clear of jokes involving 2SLGBTQ plus identities or stereotypes or elements, because again, chances are, like Martine mentioned, somebody is going to feel hurt, and you know, and it's going to feel like you're making fun of them. So I think that's just one thing that I often feel like I need to note, especially to the construction and manufacturing environments. I think, you know, jokes are often quite prevalent, the teasing and joking. The other thing is, you know, some of the more, I guess, you know, personal questions, let's call them, about somebody who's queer or trans or non-binary, you know, commenting on, you know, asking about their surgeries, for example, or other gender affirming care they may have received. You know, don't, I think, especially in a public, if you're in a social setting with a lot of people, maybe steer clear of those questions, right? It's not sort of like you broke your ankle, you had surgery. It's a little bit more personal than that, right? And so, and even if you do know and somebody's trusting you with this information, you know, really not to, I think, to really steer clear about talking about that with other people. It's not juicy goss, it's not tea, it's not yours to tell. Don't do it. And then, you know, backhanded compliments is one that's come up before as well. Like if you know someone, again, just use trans folks as an example. If you know someone is trans, maybe don't say things like, "Oh, but you look like a real girl," or "I wouldn't have guessed you were trans." So these are things that people have asked me before if they were okay, and I was like, "No, not okay." And then, you know, things like question your own assumptions, and then educate yourself. I think that's one, just to go back to Martine's point about, you know, the bar is elevating and evolving. You know, I think 50, 100 years ago, when people didn't really have access to information, like, you know, libraries or, you know, technology like we do today, it might have been a different story. But I think, you know, like if, like, I know everybody here has access to technology because you logged into this call today. And so, you know, I know you have access to the internet and, you know, different resources. And, you know, most of you are likely educated, highly educated. So you have the privilege of being educated and likely know how to identify, you know, credible sources for learning, you know, and so do that, please, before you go and ask, you know, your one token queer friend, or it could go for Black friend or racialized friend as well. Just, you know, look something up, educate yourself a little bit, spend 5 minutes before you go and ask, you know, your token friend a bunch of questions. Just to really, you know, think about the burden, right? If forever, like, you know, if I have 10 friends and they all wanted 3 hours of my time weekly to ask me questions about, you know, my identities, I would do nothing else, right? So I think just to be mindful of that, you know, the burden that you might be putting on somebody who's already likely, you know, who's marginalized and likely already very, very, very tired from just everything else. And the last thing I'll note maybe is just around gender inclusive language, like, you know, if you're opening you know, a talk, or, you know, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, you know, just to say, you know, guests or attendees, or just to, you know, just be mindful of you know, even though it's just a few words, that can really, for me, that often, you know, signals to me or sets the tone for me about what kind of space this is, right? So just be mindful of that. And then, you know, folks, people, instead of guys or ladies, girls. And then if you're, you know, just referring to people in general, they, them, right? And then, and just in line with that, you know, if you're not sure about how to say somebody's name, or, you know, what their pronouns are, ask them. And then once you ask them, get it right. Right. So I think those are some of the sort of I think highlights of what I think people can do to potentially become considered as an ally.
That's great. So those are all really practical things that we could be doing. I love, Martine, how you talked about how allyship, you know, manifests in many different ways, many different people. And also an important differentiation, Michelle, I think that you really brought to the table is like, maybe we need to reframe how we're talking about allyship, and that, you know, what we're talking about is how do you champion this kind of work within the workplace? What are some specific things you do? And a huge part of becoming an ally is, one, is that you're acknowledged for the championing this work by calling out things when you see them, by making space for 2SLGBTQ plus issues and people at the table. And another thing that I thought that really resonated with me that I heard you both say is how it needs to be really centered on the individual. So it's like there's some very specific things you could be doing to champion this change, but one important piece that I think really differentiates someone, you know, when they start to become that ally, talk to the people that you're championing and find out what they need and what their issues are. So that way you can figure out how you could best use your positionality to be able to help move forward those things. So that's all really great advice. So thank you both for that. I guess I'm just conscious of the time, and I know that I see that there's one question in the chat, and I just want to encourage anyone who does have additional questions, or if there's things that have come up that you want to, you know, or things that you've experienced and that you just want to put out there and have, you know, this is your opportunity to have Michelle and Martine, you know, really kind of give you their perspective on it. We want, like I said, we want this to be a safe space for you to explore these things so that you could bring them back to your respective workplaces. So please feel free to use that chat and put in any questions you may have. In the interim, I just have 3 more questions for them, and then we'll open it up to the chat. The first one, I guess, and I know that we've been touching and we've been dancing around this. Maybe we haven't danced around. We've been talking about it, but maybe not directly. Is that how are the challenges that 2SLGBTQ plus people facing are similar and unique from other marginalized groups in Canada, and does it manifest differently within engineering? You know, so how interconnected are the issues? Like, so if I'm in a workplace, you know, am I just trying to, if I'm trying to create a more inclusive environment and zeroing in on 2SLGBTQ plus people, I mean, is that even possible given the interconnectedness of all these other issues? Or I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. And then Michelle, in particular, given your experience in engineering, you know, what does that look different in engineering because of the makeup of, you know, the vast majority of engineers or not? So maybe Michelle, I'll give this question to you first.
Yeah, I think, you know, yes to both. I think, you know, I think the issues that, you know, manifest in society, you know, obviously manifest in engineering and often to a much greater magnitude. And maybe I'll just narrow in on one specific idea here, which is around, you know, and I'm, you know, this is in no way to critique women in engineering efforts. I certainly am a big part of many of those efforts and support it. And I think it's a really important initiative to bring up the number of women, you know, who participate in engineering. But now when we talk about, you know, gender diversity in engineering, for example, we often use that terminology interchangeably with, you know, gender women, you know, except that, you know, the issue with that is that there are, you know, other underrepresented genders in engineering that we don't often enough speak of, that we often actually leave out. So I think that's maybe one sort of issue that I think, you know, law, for example, medicine have better attended to within their workforce, you know, to be attentive and aware that, you know, folks of, you know, not just men and women, the binary genders, but people of other genders, or, you know, the diverse genders on the gender identity and expression spectrum are in their profession. And so that's maybe something that's specific to engineering. And I think one of the sort of, I think, you know, many pieces of the answer to that is around data. You know, we love data in engineering. We love evidence-based decision-making in engineering. And so I think, you know, one of the, you know, steps that's necessary in engineering specifically that hasn't been taken, that I think is a particular challenge around addressing some of these issues, is really the collection of data. And I don't mean, you know, like forcing your employees, and AI decided I did a thumbs up for some reason, but I definitely don't mean, you know, forcing your employees to disclose information that they may not feel safe to disclose, for example. But I do mean, you know, thoughtfully, you know, engaging a consultant, for example, that focuses on working with and collecting, you know, different demographic data. So I think doing that is quite important. And I just want to give a little bit of you know, some of the data I have here, which is not a whole lot, but, you know, according to the 2021 census, 1 in every 125 people born between 1997 and 2006, and 1 in every 200 people born between 1981 and 1996, so my generation, in Canada identify as trans or non-binary. And then the only school that I could find that collected this data was U of T engineering. Sorry, the only engineering school that I found this data from is U of T. So U of T engineering in 2022, 1 in every 30 people in the incoming class chose not to report their gender or reported themselves as another gender aside from man or women. So there's a significant presence here that we're not attending to. I think often in engineering, we like to, you know, when we have a few data points, we say they're outliers, so we take them out. But then when it comes time to make decisions based on data, we say, well, we can't actually make policy decisions or changes for this group because we have no data. So it's a bit of a circular problem that I think we need to get out of. And so that's something that I identify as a particular challenge in engineering. Maybe I'll let Martine speak to some of the challenges outside of engineering.
Mm-hmm.
No, but I agree with all that. And honestly, I really realized at Pride at a Pride event how white and LGB it was, right? And I was in an event and there was a young Black woman that says, "Oh no, me, I don't go to those events." And I was like, "Why?" She said, "Well, I don't see myself." I was like, "You're right. You're right." And we have to listen. That's the thing that I can say. We need to listen. In 2017, when Pride Toronto was stopped, I'm not saying it was right what they did, but they did highlight that we forgot a big part of our group behind. And all the marginalized one is like the two-spirit people, the queer, non-binary, trans, intersex. We left everybody behind in a way. And this is why they're saying you cannot be proud without us. We have to be proud all together. So I find that it did like me, because I always see age sometimes is in the way, you need to evolve, and I come from before, but it really did stop me to think, wait a second. And even my wife, she's a two-spirited and she's bisexual. So, and that whole thing, what happened too is we colonize everybody. So now we go in reserve and different place where the indigenous lives, and they get discriminated because of religion. So it's harder for somebody that is indigenous to come out right now than it is for us. It's harder for somebody from the Black community to come out than it is for us, because at the end of the day, in our history, we went on and we went and colonized everybody with our religion. So they embrace that religion and now they discriminate each other. So that's why I find that the discrepancy everywhere, and it's why we need to work together, and we need to have people from all the different, like Michelle says, and she's right, there's other gender, and we need to talk about those other gender, and they need to be represented. And even like me, I always like right now a lot about women in leadership. Where is the queer woman? Where is the non-binary woman? Where's the lesbian or the trans woman and women in leadership? We don't see them in women in leadership. So is every woman embracing every gender into the women's spectrum? That's the other question to ask ourselves. And I find that we have to work together, because as women first, or as a gender, we still have a lot of issue. Look at the issue with gender with kids and all this. So we need to be working together for that change. And to ensure that we bring all the group at the table. And it's a very collective effort. And it's not easy. It's not like the best relationship right now, right? There's a lot of debate. There's Pride should be, more like before, a manifestation for our rights and everything instead of a big event. But if we go backward, when it was a manifestation, it was the cigarette company and the beer company that was the sponsor. So do we want to go back there? Is that what we're looking? Or we want to work with corporation today, to be more inclusive and not just be big bang, but that we embrace everybody. So that's why I started the conversation today about evolve. We need to evolve. And that means everybody, me included, our community, and we need to open our eyes, and look at everybody at the same value.
Mm-hmm. I actually think that's a pretty good transition into, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming through the chat. And there's someone who asked the question around, and we didn't actually directly ask this, so I'm glad that you put it forward. So within workplaces, we know that there's a lot of things that they're doing. We've made a lot of recommendations of things that they could do, but how do they know where they stand? I mean, Michelle, you kind of alluded to this around, like, we need more data, we need to be benchmarking against something. And that perhaps that would include like some kind of surveys and things that you're doing around belonging and inclusiveness and how people feel in the workplace. But as an organization who wants to do better and wants to, ensure that I have a safe space where everyone feels like they belong, in order to have that competitive advantage to bring in, the best and brightest, irregardless of who they are, where they come from, and ensure that we're innovative when we're meeting demands and represent our community. What are some ways that organizations could be benchmarking themselves? Is there anything in particular that you, and Martine, this goes to you as well, because I know that, you helped to put these together at IBM and other organizations. Are there very specific things that you recommend that organizations should be tracking when it comes to this data? And maybe I'll open it to Martine first.
I think so. Like I said, even at IBM, it's called About You. And it is, I think, if you want to see a change in a place, you need the data, like Michelle said. We have no choice. We need to gather the data. And I think a good place to gather the data is when you have the About You, the employee. So you can ask them all different kind of detail, and one of them is you can ask them where they see themselves. And then if they want to auto-declare they're part of the community. And if they don't want to, they say they don't want to. But at the same time, that data tells me, oh, in Canada, they're doing good. I know in France, it's not working well. So maybe we can put things in place. And that's how it started. Even at TD, in 1994, they put the same-sex benefit and nobody was taking it. And that's why in 2005, Ed Clark decided to put the logo of TD on Toronto Pride. And people didn't put their money in the bank account. People withdraw their money. It was really hard to do that, but it was a way to send a very clear message to the employee. It's okay, you can take same-sex benefit. We won't discriminate you if you do so. We won't out you and you won't have any repercussion. So I find it is very important to get that data. So even now at TD, same thing. And it is a bit my responsibility as a member of the community to answer those questions. Me, I always say things on two sides. We can complain as much as we want. We can be victim. And yes, I was a victim and I was discriminated as a woman or as a lesbian. But I think it is my responsibility to answer those questions and help that corporation be able to see, oh yeah, okay, I have that many. Oh, they're okay to be out. Or they're gonna get engaged, because in those questions, you can even ask, would you agree to get engaged? Or if we contact you, would you be part of? And that helps because at TD, there's a thing called Lead to be Proud. So then they choose people out of that are doing good in their corporation. And they're sending them in that training to help them to become leaders of those employee resource groups. So it's another way to help that employee resource group to be built. But me, I'm a IBM girl too. So data for me is like key. I believe in it, and I think it is crucial to have those numbers.
Great, thank you. I just want to acknowledge that we're almost at time. Colby, I know that we didn't verbalize the answer, but please know that we've acknowledged it and Michelle has addressed it in the chat. So, and they very graciously made themselves available for yourself. You have additional questions. So, but with that, what I'd like to do now is I just want to thank our panelists for all the time that they've given to us and all the knowledge and sharing their own personal lived experiences. I think, the whole intent of today was really to ensure that we were having that open and honest conversation, giving people an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this community and specifically what they could do as employers or champions and ideally allies for the community and how they could be moving this forward. So that way we can create a more inclusive and safe workplace for everyone. Before we wrap it up today, I would like to pass it over to Gerard McDonald, Engineers Canada's CEO, for the final words. So Gerard, over to you.
Thanks, Kim, for moderating today's discussion. And I'd like to express my gratitude and appreciation on behalf of Engineers Canada to Michelle and Martine for joining us today and for sharing their experiences, their insights, and their perspectives with us. I think I can speak for everyone who's attended today that it was an incredibly valuable discussion as we mark Pride Month and as we strive to create a more inclusive engineering profession. I'd also like to express our gratitude to TD Insurance for sponsoring today's webinar and for their sponsorship of the 30 by 30 conference last month. TD is a valuable partner for Engineers Canada, and we appreciate their support of our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. And thanks to each and every one of you for attending today, for taking time out of your busy schedules to celebrate Pride with us, and for demonstrating an interest in and commitment in making our workplaces and the engineering profession as a whole inclusive for 2SLGBTQ plus people. At Engineers Canada, we know the value that diverse perspectives bring to the engineering profession, given the role in their communities. It's incredibly important that engineers not only reflect the communities they serve, but that they truly serve the community through their work, their designs, and their engineering solutions. It's for that reason that Engineers Canada remains committed to realizing a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive profession. The work has been and remains one of our strategic priorities at Engineers Canada, and conversations like the one we heard today are important in making all of us in engineering reflect on our own contributions to make engineering a more inclusive profession. So thank you to Kim, Michelle, and Martine. Thank you to all our attendees, and happy Pride to everyone.